Chapter 1. The Man Behind the Mystery. The desert stretches endlessly in every direction, silent, dry, and humming with secrets only the wind seems to know. Out here, in the Nevada wilderness, the night sky is vast and merciless, a dome of stars above a land of dust and silence. The roads leading here are little more than scars of forgotten dirt, winding through the emptiness until they vanish behind fences of barbed wire. Somewhere beyond those fences begins a story both strange and unsettling. A story that would etch one man's name into the lore of UFOs forever. Bob Lazar. To set the stage, imagine yourself standing in the middle of that desert. The air is thin and cold at night. Even as the ground still breathes out the heat it swallowed during the day, you hear nothing, no insects, no distant engines, only the faint hum of your own heartbeat. The horizon looks endless, but you know, hidden in the darkness, there are cameras, motion sensors, and guards who see you even if you cannot see them. This is the world where Lazar's story begins, a place where secrets do not sleep. Robert Scott. Lazar was not always a household name, not even in the shadowy circles of UFO enthusiasts. Born on January 26, 1959, in Coral Gables, Florida, he grew up like many other children, yet he was different. From a young age, Bob was drawn to machines, not toys, but engines, wires, chemicals, anything that sparked or hummed or threatened to explode. He was a tinkerer, a boy who saw a rocket engine not as danger but as possibility. He would later describe himself as someone who could not stop pulling things apart just to understand how they worked. If it had wires, if it glowed, if it threatened fire, he was fascinated. By the early 1980s, Lazar had followed his curiosity west, landing in Las Vegas, Nevada. In the glow of casinos and desert neon, he seemed an ordinary man. But according to his claims, he was anything but ordinary. He said he worked at Los Alamos National Laboratory, not as a janitor or technician, but as a physicist. The laboratory itself, famous for its classified projects, was a fitting place for someone drawn to secrets. Yet, as with so much in his story, the records are contradictory. Some insist he was never there, that no trace of his employment exists. Others point to directories and local newspaper articles showing him near particle accelerators, his name listed among the staff. The truth is blurry, caught between erasure and confirmation. Still, one fact is certain. Bob Lazar would soon stand at the center of one of the most controversial claims in modern history. It was 1989 when his voice first reached the public ear. Appearing on a Las Vegas television program, his face hidden in shadow, his name concealed under the alias Dennis, Lazar made a claim that would ripple across the world. He said he had worked not just in a laboratory, but on alien spacecraft. The name of the place was S4, a facility near the infamous Area 51, carved into the mountains near Papoose Lake. According to Lazar, the U.S. government held 9 craft there, 9 machines not of this earth, stored in hangars designed to look like natural rock. His role, he claimed, was to help reverse engineer their propulsion system. He wasn't told where they came from, but the implication was clear. They were built by beings not human. The propulsion system, he explained, was unlike anything known to science. It ran on a mysterious fuel, an isotope he called Element 115. At the time, this element did not exist on the periodic table. Lazar claimed it was the heart of the craft, capable of generating gravity waves, bending space-time itself, allowing the saucers to move instantaneously from one point to another. They didn't fly, he said. They fell into space that had been warped ahead of them. a kind of elegant cheat code written into the universe. To anyone watching, Lazar seemed calm, not a frantic dreamer, not a wild-eyed storyteller. He spoke with a precision that unnerved skeptics and thrilled believers. He described the hangars, the security checks, even the hand scanners used to confirm personnel identity. Decades later, such scanners would become reality, but in 1989 they sounded like science fiction. This quiet confidence gave his claims an edge of credibility, even as institutions scrambled to disprove them. And yet, doubt followed swiftly. When journalists checked his educational records, his supposed degrees from MIT and Caltech, they found nothing. No yearbooks, no rosters, no transcripts. It was as if he had never been there at all. Lazar countered that the government had erased his past, wiping clean any evidence of his education to discredit him. Whether this was deliberate erasure or fabrication became another mystery layered atop the first. Each attempt to clarify his story seemed only to deepen the shadows. More strange were the details Lazar provided about S4 itself. He described the layout, the hangars carved into the mountainside, the craft themselves. One in particular, the one he called the sport model, shimmered as if bending light around it. It was compact, metallic, seamless, so unlike human construction that it seemed to belong to another reality. Inside, he said, the ceilings were low, the chairs too small, as if designed for beings shorter than humans, minimalist, alien, and unsettling. In his briefings, Lazar claimed, he read documents that suggested the origin of these craft, the Zeta Reticuli star system, nearly 40 light-years away. The files hinted at decades of contact, stretching back to the late 1940s, with materials recovered long before he arrived. If true, it meant the world had been living in the shadow of another intelligence for nearly half a century. For many, Lazar's story was a revelation. For others, it was a fabrication. Some said he invented it for fame. Others argued he was part of a larger disinformation campaign, a pawn in a game played by forces larger than himself. But what made his story linger was not the drama, but the detail. He spoke of things that seemed impossible to imagine unless you had seen them. He wasn't vague, he was precise. And that precision was either the mark of a witness or the skill of an elaborate liar. Over the years, certain elements of his story gained strange validation. The location of S4 near Papoose Lake, once dismissed, was later identified in satellite images, showing structures that could fit his descriptions. The biometric hand scanners he described were eventually revealed to be real, used at secure military installations. And then there was element 115. In 2003, scientists succeeded in synthesizing it, unstable, decaying in milliseconds, but real. To skeptics, this meant nothing. To believers, it meant Lazar had described something a decade before science confirmed it. So who was Bob Lazar, really? Was he a scientist turned whistleblower? A man who saw too much and felt compelled to speak? Was he a clever hoaxer with just enough knowledge of physics to weave a believable tale? Or was he something else? Perhaps a messenger, intentional or not, carrying secrets too large for any one man? What is certain is that his story reshaped the world's relationship with Area 51. Before Lazar, it was a name whispered in military circles. After Lazar, it became a cultural phenomenon, synonymous with UFOs, secrecy, and government cover-ups. His words fueled decades of speculation, from conspiracy theories to Hollywood films. He opened a door, and once opened, it could never fully close again. As you listen to this story, you might ask yourself, What if he was telling the truth? What if the silent desert of Nevada, the barbed wire fences, and the blacked-out buses really do guard a secret so extraordinary it could change everything we know about science, about government, about ourselves? And if so, why was Bob Lazar the one chosen or cursed to see it? The desert winds still move across Groom Lake. The fences still stand. Cameras still watch. And somewhere out there, perhaps, lies the truth Lazar claimed to touch. Whether you believe him or not, the question lingers. It hovers in the silence, refusing to fade. And as we drift deeper into this mystery, past the checkpoints and into the darkness, the story of Bob Lazar begins its long echo. Good night. For now. As Chapter 2, Life in the Shadows. The story does not pause once a secret has been spoken. It lingers, reshaping everything in its wake. For Bob Lazar, the moment he stepped into the light in 1989, his life fractured into before and after. Before, he was a curious tinkerer with a fascination for rockets and reactors. After, he was something else. A man burdened with a truth too large for ordinary living. And in those after years, he learned what it meant to live in the shadows. Imagine the days immediately following his televised revelation. His voice, distorted for anonymity, had barely finished echoing across Nevada's television screens before his world began to collapse. He had expected skepticism, maybe even ridicule. What he hadn't expected was the silence that pressed in on him afterward. Silence, yes, but not emptiness. Phones clicked with strange interruptions. Computers glitched without reason. At night, headlights sat too long at the end of his street, the kind of attention that pretends to be invisible but makes itself felt like static in the skin. It was as though the desert itself had followed him home. Bob tried to move forward. He opened a small company, United Nuclear, selling scientific equipment, chemicals, high-voltage supplies, rare lab glassware. The kind of store that would have suited him as a boy, still fascinated with sparks and explosions. On the surface, it was mundane, a shop for experimenters and hobbyists. But beneath it lay the quiet knowledge that its owner was carrying something extraordinary. To customers, he was a businessman with a quick wit. To others, he remained the man who once claimed to have touched alien craft. But even in his new life, the shadows never left. Inspectors visited often. Shipments were delayed without explanation. Packages arrived sliced open and resealed with clumsy tape, as though someone had been checking, searching, cataloging. Bob rarely spoke about these intrusions, but friends noticed his unease. They saw how his eyes flicked toward windows during conversations, how he measured his words as if every sentence carried weight beyond the room. The firebrand of 1989, the man who risked exposure on television, had grown quieter, not broken, simply cautious. A voice that had once shouted into the storm now whispered, measuring the cost of every word. His family felt the strain too. His wife, Joy, recalled nights when the power flickered out without cause, when phones rang and no one answered, when dark vehicles idled outside their home until dawn. To the outside world, this sounded like paranoia. But inside those walls, it felt like a siege. They learned to live with it, like a chronic ache. Never gone, never entirely acknowledged. It wasn't the kind of pressure that crushed you all at once. It eroded, grain by grain, like desert sand against stone. In quieter moments, Bob admitted he sometimes regretted speaking out. Not because he believed he was wrong, but because of what it did to the lives around him. It wasn't worth it, he said in one rare interview. Not because he doubted himself, but because truth had turned his life into a labyrinth of suspicion. Yet even in that admission, There was no retraction. He never once said he had lied. He never softened his claims. He carried them like a scar, tender, permanent, but undeniably his. The most haunting part was how ordinary his days looked from the outside. Customers would enter his shop and find Bob stocking shelves, measuring powders, or tightening bolts on equipment. He would greet them politely, sell them chemicals, answer their questions. To most, he was just another small business owner. But beneath that surface ran the quiet river of memory. Every screw he tightened, every vial he labeled, was done by hands that had once touched something alien, something cold and seamless, something that did not belong to Earth. He lived between two worlds, the mundane present and the impossible past. Some customers recognized him, of course. They came not for chemicals, but for a handshake, a photograph, or a whispered thank you. A few even wept, overcome by the idea of meeting the man who had dared to speak what others only imagined. Bob never quite knew what to do with that reverence. He would nod, shake hands, smile awkwardly, then return to his work. The shelves needed restocking, orders needed packing. Life in its stubborn ordinariness always demanded attention. But in the evenings, when the shop closed and the desert night reclaimed the horizon, Lazar's thoughts returned to S4. He would stand outside, gazing at the stars, his face half-shadowed in the glow of porch light. The memories did not fade. The shimmer of the sport model, the way its surface bent light, the hum that rattled his chest during flight tests, they were as vivid as ever. He often said he thought about it every day, not as a choice, but as inevitability. Some memories, once touched, do not let go. And so the shadows deepened, not only around his life, but within it. Bob had become a man split in two. To skeptics, he was a liar clinging to a fabrication. To believers, he was a prophet of forbidden knowledge. To himself, he was something more ordinary, a man who had seen something unforgettable and been forced to carry it alone. Fame was never his goal. He never toured conventions. He never sold merchandise. He declined most interviews. The louder the world shouted about UFOs, the quieter Bob became. This quietness became its own kind of testimony. In a world of hoaxers and self-promoters, his refusal to exploit his story stood out. If it was a lie, why not profit from it? Why not write books, sell tickets, bask in the attention? Instead, Bob returned to his shop, his experiments, his quiet routines. That very reluctance only sharpened the mystery. Was this the behavior of a con man, or of a man who carried a truth too heavy for the spotlight? The shadows, of course, never stopped moving. Helicopters still hovered at odd hours. Cars with tinted windows still appeared in his neighborhood. Friends reported strange clicks on their phones after speaking with him. It was never overt, never enough to prove, just enough to remind. The watchers did not need to silence him. They only needed to remind him that he was never alone. And so life in the shadows stretched into decades. The fire of 1989 cooled into a kind of steady glow. Bob Lazar did not vanish, but he did not chase the light either. He became a figure you could almost forget, until some new revelation about UFOs or secret programs brought his name back, whispered like a memory in the dark. Always there, always waiting. He had not changed his story, not once. And in a world where stories shift like sand, that consistency was its own kind of gravity. So as you picture him in those quiet years, behind a shop counter tinkering with devices, or staring at the night sky, ask yourself, was Bob Lazar hiding from the world, or was the world hiding from him? Did the shadows follow him because he lied, or because he told the truth? The answers, like the desert horizon, remain just out of reach. But the weight of those shadows, their persistence, their silence, speaks louder than any denial. And in that silence, as the desert wind rattles against the windows, the man behind the mystery remains not in the spotlight, but in the shadows he never escaped. Chapter 3. The Desert Stakeouts. The desert has a way of holding silence, of amplifying even the smallest sound until it feels enormous. A pebble shifting underfoot becomes a drumbeat. A whisper between friends seems like a shout. And under the vast Nevada sky, every moment feels both intimate and infinite. This was the stage where Bob Lazar made one of his most dangerous choices. Not in a laboratory, not behind a television screen, but out in the open desert with only the stars to bear witness. The choice to watch. After his time at S4, after he had glimpsed technology that bent light and mocked gravity, Lazar found himself caught between secrecy and revelation. His clearance had silenced him. His conscience urged him otherwise. He could not shake the images, the sport model shimmering in its hangar, the low hum that rattled his chest during a test flight. He had seen too much, and like a wound that refuses to heal, the memory bled into every thought. He needed someone else to see it. He needed confirmation, not from documents, not from experiments, but from eyes that were not his own. So he invited friends. It wasn't a casual decision. To take people into restricted territory, to guide them toward Groom Lake and Papoose Mountain, was to risk everything. Yet Lazar's fear and fascination made unlikely companions. He convinced himself there was safety in numbers, that the desert at night could hide them, that the government would not notice a small group on a forgotten dirt trail. He chose Wednesday nights, midweek, when schedules were predictable and the sky dark enough to swallow intruders. With camcorders, binoculars, and restless anticipation, they drove away from Las Vegas into the desert's lonely heart. Their convoy was unremarkable, ordinary cars loaded with people who wanted to believe, or at least wanted to know. Beside him rode Gene Huff, a close friend and fellow physicist, and Carol, his wife at the time. They were not thrill-seekers. They were curious souls, drawn by Bob's urgency and his quiet conviction that something extraordinary would unfold. Their destination was not a city, not a monument, but an empty stretch of desert overlooking Papoose Lake, close enough to watch, but far enough to hope they would not be seen. The first night, anticipation was its own kind of gravity. They set up tripods, adjusted lenses, checked batteries. The desert air grew colder by the minute, the kind of chill that sneaks through jackets and into bone. Above them, stars multiplied by the thousands, scattered jewels against velvet black. The world seemed endless. And then, it wasn't. A glow appeared. At first, faint, like a lantern blurred by distance, then brighter, clearer, deliberate. The light hovered, pulsed softly, and then moved, up sideways, down. Movements that no plane, no helicopter, no human craft should make. Smooth, fluid, indifferent to inertia. It danced against the horizon like a secret being whispered by the sky itself. The group fell silent. For a moment, even the desert seemed to hold its breath. The camcorders trembled, struggling to capture more than a glowing dot. The binoculars revealed only motion without explanation, but to those present, it was more than enough. Lazar turned to them, whispering what they were already thinking. "That's it. That's the sport model." His voice was steady, but beneath it ran a current of awe and terror. He was no longer the sole witness. Others now shared his burden. They had seen something that should not exist. For Huff, the physicist, the sight was electrifying. He knew equations, formulas, the constraints of physics. And what he saw mocked all of them. For Carol, it was terrifying. Her husband's strange friend had pulled her into a night of shadows, and now she could not unsee what hung in the sky. They all filmed, they all watched, but more than anything, they all felt. And feeling is sometimes the strongest evidence of all. Over the following weeks, they returned. Again on Wednesdays, again under cover of darkness. Each time they saw the light. Sometimes it hovered, sometimes it darted across the sky, sometimes it blinked away as if swallowed by nothing. It was never the same, yet always familiar. The glow became like a ghost, expected but unpredictable. They began to joke nervously, calling themselves spectators of a show no ticket could buy. But beneath the humor was tension. Each return increased the risk. Each night in the desert tightened the invisible noose of surveillance. And surveillance, it turned out, was never far behind. On one particular night, as they set up their equipment, Lazar noticed a faint glint on the horizon. Not a star, not a glow, a reflection. Vehicles, at first distant, then closer, deliberate. Within moments, the night erupted with harsh light. Spotlights bathed the desert in artificial day, blinding in its suddenness. Out of the darkness came military personnel, armed, precise, uncompromising. They did not shout, they did not stumble. They appeared with the quiet efficiency of those who had been watching all along. The group froze. Cameras were seized, IDs collected, questions asked in clipped tones, names recorded, warnings delivered. No arrests, but the message was clear. You are seen. You are trespassing on more than land. You are trespassing on secrets. For Lazar, the experience was chilling. He had crossed a line not just by speaking, but by dragging others across it with him. And the watchers, whoever they were, had no intention of letting him forget it. Back at home, the consequences sharpened. Lazar was confronted with transcripts of his private phone calls, proof that his life was being monitored in ways both intimate and invasive. He was told sternly, directly, that his involvement with S4 was over, that he was no longer welcome, no longer trusted, perhaps no longer safe. The message was less about rules and more about power. The watchers did not need to punish him. They only needed to remind him that they could. But even that did not extinguish the memory. For those who had joined him, the desert stakeouts became a defining moment. Huff would later say that the movement of those lights could not be reconciled with any human technology. Carol would speak less, her silence itself an echo of what she had seen. And Lazar carried the knowledge that he had not been alone. Whatever skepticism the world hurled at him, he now had witnesses. Not scientists with laboratories, not officials with authority, but friends. Eyes that had seen what his had seen. A small army of believers, born not from persuasion, but from experience. Years later, the footage still circulates. Grainy, shaky, barely more than dots against black sky. Skeptics point to it as useless, nothing but lights without context. Believers point to the testimony, the consistency, the impossibility of the maneuvers, but in the end, the videos matter less than the night itself. For those who were there, it was not about evidence. It was about confirmation. About the strange and terrifying comfort of knowing you were not insane, that someone else had seen what you had seen. And so the desert stakeouts became legend within a legend. A story nested inside a larger mystery, whispered across late-night radio shows and internet forums. Not proof, not disproof, but a haunting anecdote that refuses to fade. It carries the texture of myth, friends in the desert, lights in the sky, soldiers emerging from nowhere. Ordinary people pulled into extraordinary circumstances and then returned to their lives with memories too strange to dismiss. When you imagine it now, close your eyes and picture the scene, the cold air biting, the stars endless, the glow rising silently from behind the mountains. Feel the way your chest tightens when it hovers too still, when it darts too suddenly, when it disappears too completely. Imagine the headlights that appear from nowhere, the spotlights that erase the night, the soldiers' boots crunching on gravel. Then imagine the silence that follows long after you have gone home. A silence that hums louder than noise, a silence that whispers, asterisk, you saw it. You cannot forget it, but you cannot speak of it either. For Bob Lazar, the desert stakeouts were both liberation and imprisonment. Liberation, because he had finally shared his burden with others. Imprisonment, because the watchers had shown their reach, their patience, their quiet omnipresence. He had crossed into forbidden territory, not just physically, but morally, spiritually. And though the desert still stands open, vast and silent, he knew it was no longer free. Every grain of sand, every shadowed ridge, every flickering star was part of a theater in which he had played a dangerous role. So the question remains, what did they truly see? Was it alien craft, defying physics with grace and silence? Was it advanced human technology, hidden in the desert night? Or was it something else altogether, a vision born of hope, fear, and imagination? The answer lingers somewhere between the glow of those lights and the silence that followed. A silence that still stretches across the Nevada desert, waiting for the next pair of eyes to look up and wonder. And if you ever find yourself standing in that same desert, cold air against your skin, stars wheeling above, you may feel it too, that weight of anticipation, that sense that the night is not empty. You may even see a glow. And if you do, remember Bob Lazar, standing with his friends, whispering to the darkness, "That's it. That's the sport model." Then, like them, you will never forget. The desert will not let you. Chapter 4. The Physics of the Impossible. There are stories that depend on emotion, on awe, on the tremble in a voice. And then there are stories that cling to detail, to diagrams sketched on napkins, to the hum of machines no one else has seen. Bob Lazar's tale sits uneasily in both worlds. He did not just say he witnessed flying saucers, he tried to explain them. In quiet interviews, his voice low and deliberate, he spoke of reactors smaller than basketballs, of gravitational waves bent like ripples in water, of elements the world had not yet discovered. To skeptics, it sounded like science fiction. To believers, it sounded like revelation. And in between lay the impossible. At the center of it all was the craft's heart, a reactor. Not a roaring engine or a tangled mess of wires, but a silent core, smooth and contained, so small it could be carried in both arms. Lazar described it as the source of everything, the hum, the light, the defiance of gravity itself. He said it operated without combustion, without exhaust, without any of the familiar signs of energy we know. Instead, it created its own gravitational field, bending the fabric of space like a sheet of paper pressed beneath a fingertip. The ship did not push through the sky. It fell into the fold it created. To describe it, Lazar used analogies more poetic than technical. "It's like throwing a stone into a pond," he said. "The ripples are gravity, and the craft rides those ripples wherever it wants to go." At the time he spoke, in 1989, such words carried an air of madness. Gravity was not something humanity could manipulate. We measured it, we endured it, but we could not generate or steer it. And yet Lazar claimed that the craft at S4 did precisely that, with elegance, with silence, with frightening ease. Fueling this impossible machine, he said, was an element no one had ever touched on Earth. He called it element 115. On the periodic table, it was nothing more than a theoretical entry, a whisper on the edge of scientific speculation. But to Lazar, it was real, tangible, a small piece of something not of this world. He described it as stable, unlike the unstable versions our laboratories would one day produce. When bombarded inside the reactor, it released a kind of energy unknown to physics. Anti-gravitational, clean, controlled, not heat, not radiation, just force, direct, invisible, overwhelming. Imagine that for a moment. An isotope not born in human accelerators, but carried across the stars. A fuel that did not burn or explode, but instead bent reality itself. If it existed, it would render fossil fuels obsolete, rockets irrelevant, engines quaint relics of a primitive age. With such power, interstellar travel was not fantasy, but inevitability. And perhaps that inevitability had already arrived, hidden in the Nevada desert, waiting for hands bold enough, or foolish enough, to tinker with it. Lazar claimed the craft contained 3 gravity amplifiers, mounted in a triangular configuration beneath its floor. Each amplifier could project a gravitational wave, like a spotlight of distortion. By directing them forward, the craft did not fly. It toppled into the distortion, falling gracefully toward its destination. He described how the ship oriented itself belly first, not nose first, because its propulsion was not about aerodynamics, but about warping the space ahead. It was, as he put it, less like a plane in the sky and more like a leaf sliding effortlessly across the surface of water. The descriptions were vivid but unsettling. They mocked the laws we thought were immovable. No sound, no trail of exhaust, no heat signatures, just silence and motion, fluid and terrifying. To hear him tell it was to glimpse a reality in which the rules of physics bent not just for theory but for practice. Skeptics dismiss these words as technobabble, a stringing together of scientific terms without foundation. Gravitational amplifiers sounded like the jargon of science fiction novels, not laboratory manuals, but others listened more closely. They noted that Lazar, for all his imprecision, spoke in ways that aligned eerily with certain theories: wormholes, curvature of space-time, gravitational lensing. These were not inventions of fantasy. They were pillars of modern physics, though far beyond our technological reach. Could Lazar have stumbled into a vocabulary too advanced for a hoaxer? Or was he repeating, with careful restraint, what he had read in briefings at S4? One detail stood out more than most: the bending of light. Lazar said the gravity amplifiers could distort light itself, rendering the craft nearly invisible when powered on. To an observer, it would shimmer, blur, fade like a mirage in desert heat. This, too, sounded absurd, until decades later, when scientists explored metamaterials capable of bending light around objects. The connection was not proof, but it was enough to keep questions alive. Was Lazar describing alien technology? Or was he predicting, by chance or by insight, discoveries humanity would only stumble upon years later? The most haunting part of his account was not the technical detail, but the humility with which he delivered it. "We didn't understand it," he said plainly. His team was compartmentalized, each group focused on a single aspect: metallurgy, control systems, propulsion. He was never given the whole picture. He was told only what he needed to know, and even that was a fragment. The left hand never knew the right. Guards patrolled hallways. Conversations were monitored. Warnings were constant. To Lazar, it felt less like a laboratory and more like a shrine, where each acolyte was allowed to touch only one corner of the relic, never the whole. And yet, even in those fragments, he glimpsed something that altered him forever. Technology that did not belong, that could not belong. Machines that flew like whispers and hummed like thunder. Physics that turned the impossible into routine. In 2003, more than a decade after Lazar first spoke, scientists in Russia and the United States synthesized a new element, moscovium, with atomic number 115. It was unstable, decaying in milliseconds. Skeptics seized on this as proof of Lazar's fabrication. If element 115 existed only for a blink of time, how could it fuel anything? But Lazar had anticipated this. The version used in the craft, he said, was a stable isotope, something not found on Earth, perhaps not producible here at all. It was either manufactured elsewhere or native to a star system far from ours. A fragment of another world, never meant for our hands. The coincidence was unnerving. He had named an element 14 years before science confirmed its existence. And though the match was imperfect, the echo was undeniable. For believers, this was vindication. For skeptics, it was coincidence. But for Lazar, it was something simpler. He had seen it. He had touched it. It had hummed in the air beside him. And whether the world caught up to that truth or not, it no longer mattered. It was burned into his memory like fire into wood. To sit with this chapter of his story is to feel the pull of paradox. On one hand, it strains belief. Small reactors generating gravitational waves, craft sliding belly first through folded space, elements stable beyond the reach of our labs. On the other, it tempts curiosity, the eerie overlap with theoretical physics, the coincidences that later gained weight, the calm insistence of a man who never changed his story. Belief and doubt circle each other like desert winds, neither strong enough to silence the other. And so we are left not with proof, but with a question. If Lazar was lying, how did he lie so consistently, so precisely, with details that time itself seemed to confirm? And if he was telling the truth, what does that mean for us, for our science, our future, our place in the universe? Close your eyes and imagine the sport model hovering in its hangar, its surface seamless, its hum a low vibration in your chest. Imagine the amplifiers glowing faintly beneath it, the reactor pulsing at its core, space bending invisibly around it. Imagine standing there, hands trembling, realizing that everything you know about motion, distance, and time is suddenly inadequate, that you are not looking at a machine, but at a riddle written not for you, but left in your care nonetheless. That is the physics of the impossible, not because it cannot be explained, but because explanation itself feels too small. It is the kind of truth that does not fit comfortably in equations, that resists our categories, that whispers of horizons far beyond the desert sky. And whether you believe Bob Lazar or not, that whisper lingers. It hums, it waits. It bends the silence around it, daring you to listen. Good night. Chapter 5. The Weight of Memory. Time does not erase everything. Some memories harden like stone, becoming heavier the longer they are carried. For Bob Lazar, the years after 1989 were not years of forgetting. They were years of remembering. Remembering too much, remembering too clearly, remembering in ways that pulled at every corner of his life. Memory became not a gift, but a burden. It shaped his posture, his voice, even the way he looked past the horizon, as if searching for a place to set it down. This was the weight of memory. In the beginning, memory was sharp. The hangars carved into the Nevada mountainside, the security checkpoints, the blacked-out bus that carried him blindfolded by curtains. He could recall the smell of the desert air as the doors opened, the sudden coolness inside the facility, the metallic tang of machines that were not supposed to exist. He remembered the sport model shimmering faintly in its bay, as if it were trying to vanish even while standing still. Every detail etched itself onto his mind like carvings into glass. When he closed his eyes, it was all still there, clearer than dreams, heavier than nightmares. But memory is not just what you see, it is what it costs. The cost arrived slowly, first in phone calls that clicked with invisible ears, then in friends who withdrew, no longer wanting to share in the strange gravity of his story. Employers turned cautious, journalists turned predatory, neighbors turned curious in ways that felt like suspicion. Every time Bob walked into a grocery store, he wondered who recognized him. Every time a car lingered at the end of his street, he wondered who watched. The memories he carried were invisible to others, but the consequences they dragged into his life were not. He once said, "It wasn't worth it." Not because he thought he was wrong, but because the weight never lifted. Speaking had not set him free. It had shackled him to a story that no one could fully believe, yet no one could forget. His truth became a cage. At home, the weight pressed most on the quietest moments. His wife saw it in the way he stared at his workbench, tools in his hands but eyes elsewhere. She saw it in the pauses before he answered questions, as if measuring every syllable against some invisible danger. She saw it in the exhaustion that clung to him, the kind that comes not from labor, but from vigilance. Living with Bob Lazar meant living with a man haunted not by ghosts but by machines, cold, metallic, seamless machines that refused to let him go. Even his shop, United Nuclear, became a strange stage for memory. Customers came for chemicals, for equipment, for curiosities. But occasionally someone came for him, for the handshake, the whispered thank you, the story that still burned in their imaginations. And in those encounters, Lazar's memories sharpened again. He would sketch diagrams on scraps of paper, draw the amplifiers, the reactor, the triangular arrangement beneath the craft. His hand moved automatically, as though retracing something burned into muscle memory. He never embellished, never altered, always the same, always consistent. And with each repetition, the weight grew heavier. As the years passed, Lazar's memory began to live in contradiction. To skeptics, it was a fabrication, proof that he was a master storyteller repeating a practiced script. But to believers, that very repetition was evidence of truth. Who could carry the same story for decades without fracture? Who could recall the same details, the same phrases, the same diagrams, without drifting into invention? In a world where lies mutate and grow, Lazar's unchanging memory stood out like a scar, permanent, untouched, and scars, after all, come only from real wounds. The weight of memory was not only personal, it was historical. Every time a new UFO sighting appeared in the news, Lazar's name resurfaced. Every time a government program was revealed, ATIP, UAP reports, pilot testimonies, the echo returned. He said this decades ago, people whispered. His memory became a yardstick, a way to measure how close the world was to admitting what he had claimed all along. But the echo was double-edged. It kept him alive in the story, but it also chained him to it. He could not move beyond it. He could only carry it further. And so the years rolled on. His hair thinned, his face aged, but his eyes stayed sharp, the eyes of a man who had seen something unforgettable. He rarely volunteered his story anymore, but when asked, he spoke with the same calm cadence. No embellishment, no revision, just the memory, as heavy as ever. A memory that belonged to him, yet never left him alone. In private, he tinkered with small experiments, ion engines, magnetic coils, projects that scratched the itch of curiosity without answering the questions that burned deepest. Friends who visited noticed notebooks on his workbench, filled with sketches and formulas, fragments of a larger puzzle. It was not obsession exactly, but something quieter, a ritual of remembrance. He could not replicate what he had seen at S4, but he could honor the memory of it by trying. Each line of ink was a reminder. This happened. You were there. Don't forget. But forgetting was never the danger. The danger was remembering too much. Late at night, Lazar sometimes stood outside his home, staring at the stars. For most, the stars are invitations to dream. For him, they were reminders. He knew what hid in the silence between them, or at least he believed he did. The hum in his chest, the glow bending light, the impossible motion. These were not dreams. They were memories, and they pressed on him with the weight of inevitability. He could not look at the sky without feeling the burden of knowing, and the ache of realizing the world might never believe. The weight of memory is not only in the mind, it settles in the body. It bends the shoulders, slows the step, softens the voice. Friends who knew Lazar said he carried himself like a man, always measuring the room, always preparing for the next question, the next doubt, the next reminder of what he had confessed. He did not crumble, but he did not stride either. He endured. And endurance, in its quiet way, is its own form of bravery. So what do we make of such a man? Was Lazar the keeper of an extraordinary truth, or the prisoner of his own imagination? Was the weight on his shoulders proof of authenticity, or the consequence of a lie too heavy to carry lightly? The paradox remains. And perhaps that is why his story persists. Because memory, whether true or false, has gravity. It pulls at those who hold it, and it pulls at those who listen. We may never know whether Lazar's memories were carved by reality or by invention. But we know they shaped him, and through him, they shaped us. Picture him now, older, quieter, standing behind the counter of his shop or in the doorway of his home. His hands are steady, but his eyes are distant, fixed on something only he can see. That something is memory, heavy, unyielding, permanent, a weight he has carried for decades without dropping, without changing, without escape. And as you imagine him there, ask yourself, if you had seen what he claimed to see, could you ever forget? Could you ever live as though you had not? The answer, perhaps, is the true burden. For some memories once carried, never let go. They live in you, shape you, and remind you that the truth, whatever it is, comes not with freedom, but with weight. And so the night deepens, the stars remain, the desert waits, and the memory of Bob Lazar hums quietly in the dark, heavy as gravity, patient as time. Good night. Chapter 6. Into the belly of the base. The road to secrets is rarely marked. It hides in plain sight, a stretch of desert indistinguishable from the rest, until it isn't. For Bob Lazar, the path to S4 was like slipping through the skin of one world and into another. Outwardly, it began with ordinary routines. Background checks, forms, polygraphs, the ritual of clearance. But once the paperwork ended, the journey shifted into shadows. What awaited him was not simply a workplace, it was a belly of silence, a cavern carved into rock where machines older than our science seemed to wait patiently for human hands. The ride itself set the tone. Lazar described being transported in a bus with windows blacked out, curtains drawn so tightly that day and night became meaningless. It was not about distance. It was about disorientation. The desert roads outside were invisible. The only sense of movement came from the subtle swaying of the bus and the crunch of tires over gravel. He sat with others, strangers with faces just as tense, all pretending not to notice one another. Each had clearance, each had purpose, but none spoke. Silence was the first rule of S4. When the bus finally stopped, the desert air rushed in, cold, sharp, unwelcoming. Before him rose mountains that appeared ordinary, unremarkable, stone and sand like countless others across Nevada. But within that rock was something else. Hangars, cut into the mountainside, their doors disguised with camouflage so precise that from a distance they looked like the cliffs themselves. Nature and secrecy folded together. To the eye, nothing. To those who knew, everything. The first time he saw the doors open, Lazar said it felt like the desert itself was peeling back a layer of skin. A hiss of hydraulics, a slab of rock rising with mechanical grace, revealing not dust and darkness, but light. White light, sterile and humming, spilling across the gravel. Inside was not a cave, but a womb, a chamber polished and engineered to conceal the impossible. 9 craft, he was told, rested within, but the one that captured him most was the one he called the sport model, sleek, compact, metallic. It shimmered faintly, as though bending light at its edges, as though its own surface resisted being fully seen. Lazar remembered reaching out to touch it. The metal was cold, smoother than steel, but strangely lighter, almost alive. No bolts, no seams, no rivets, just a shell of perfection, as though it had grown rather than been built. Inside, the strangeness deepened. The ceilings were low, the seats too small, designed perhaps for being shorter than humans. The walls curved seamlessly, no wires, no switches, no panels. At the center, a column stretched from floor to ceiling. This, he was told, was the reactor. Around it, the chamber was empty, minimalist, almost reverent. There were no instructions, no familiar controls, only the architecture of something other. The air itself seemed to carry a subtle hum, a vibration that lodged itself in his chest and stayed there long after he stepped outside. The first briefing he read hinted at origins beyond comprehension. A star system called Zeta Reticuli, nearly 40 light-years away. The document suggested these craft had been in human possession since the late 1940s, passed down through decades of secrecy. Whether he believed every word of the briefing was irrelevant. What mattered was the feeling of standing inside a machine that seemed both ancient and new, human and alien, familiar and impossible. Work at S4 was suffocating by design. Each scientist had only fragments. Metallurgists studied alloys, linguists translated symbols, engineers puzzled over propulsion. Lazar's task was narrow, reverse engineer the propulsion system, but he was given no full picture, no freedom to explore beyond his assignment. He described it as working in a library where each person was allowed to read only one page of one book, forbidden to glance at another. The result was paranoia. No one trusted anyone else. Guards patrolled constantly. Cameras followed every movement. Conversations were monitored, and questions, too many questions, were dangerous. And yet, curiosity lived even in fear. In the belly of the base, Lazar tried to make sense of what he saw. 3 gravity amplifiers arranged beneath the floor, waveguides branching from the central column, distortions that bent light during demonstrations. To describe it, he relied on metaphors. It's like folding a piece of paper so 2 points touch. The ship doesn't travel across the paper, it simply steps from one point to the other. To his ears, it was less engineering than magic, but the hum in the room reminded him it was real. There was an unease that never left him while inside the base. The walls felt too clean, the corridors too narrow, the guards too watchful. He said even the silence had weight, pressing against his chest. Once, he caught sight of another hangar opening, revealing a craft unlike the sport model, more angular, almost organic, its curves unnatural to human design. He was not allowed to approach. He was not told anything. But the glimpse stayed with him, an echo of possibilities hidden just beyond his reach. In that belly of secrecy, he realized knowledge was both abundant and starved. He was surrounded by wonders, but he was allowed to understand only fragments. And fragments he knew were dangerous. They tempted speculation, fostered paranoia, and left him with more questions than answers. When he left the facility each night, driven once more in the blacked-out bus, Lazar carried the weight of what he had seen like contraband. He could not speak of it, could not even whisper. Yet the memory pulsed within him like the reactor he had studied. He returned home to ordinary streets, ordinary houses, ordinary lights, but none of it felt ordinary anymore. Once you have stepped into the belly of S4, the world outside feels smaller, emptier, less real. Years later, when recounting those days, Lazar spoke with a mixture of awe and fatigue. Awe, because the machines were breathtaking. Fatigue, because secrecy had drained every ounce of wonder from them. What should have been discovery felt like imprisonment. He said it was like being shown the answers to questions you'd never dared ask, then told you could never speak them aloud. So what do we do with such a memory? Do we treat it as fact, a testimony of technology beyond our grasp? Do we treat it as fabrication, a story woven from fragments of science and imagination? Or do we let it linger, unsolved, like the hum in a silent room? The belly of the base remains sealed. The hangars remain hidden in stone. The sport model, if it ever sat there, remains untouched by public eyes. All we have are the words of one man, repeated over decades, unwavering in their detail. Perhaps that is enough, or perhaps it is nothing. But imagine, just for a moment, walking into such a place yourself. Imagine the desert rock peeling away to reveal light where there should be darkness. Imagine stepping into a room where air vibrates with a silent hum, where walls curve without seams, where a machine older than our science waits in silence. Imagine knowing you will never be allowed to tell the world. Would you feel awe or fear, or both at once? That is the paradox Lazar carried. The paradox of entering a base carved into stone, walking its sterile corridors, touching machines that bent space itself, and then returning home as though nothing had happened. A paradox so sharp it cut into every day of his life afterward. The belly of the base may never open to us, but the memory remains. Heavy, luminous, impossible. A reminder that beneath the surface of deserts and mountains, there may lie truths too strange to bury and too dangerous to reveal. And so, as the desert night deepens outside your window, let that image settle in you. Doors disguised as rock, opening with silent precision, revealing light where no light should be. The hum of a reactor bending space, the shimmer of a craft resisting vision, the weight of secrecy pressing down like stone. Close your eyes. The bus ride is over. The doors are opening. You are stepping into the belly of the base, and nothing will ever be the same again. Good night. Chapter 7. Echoes in the Sky. Echoes do not fade quickly in the desert. They linger, rebounding across canyons and dry lake beds, carrying whispers farther than they should. And Bob Lazar's words, spoken first in shadowed interviews and later in weary repetitions, have become such echoes. Not loud, not overwhelming, but persistent. They move through decades, across generations, reverberating in classrooms, forums, and quiet midnight conversations. The world has changed since 1989, but the sky has not. It remains vast, silent, and filled with questions that Lazar's voice seemed to stir awake. By the early 2000s, a new generation had discovered his story, not through newspapers or late-night television, but through the web. Online forums blossomed with speculation. Amateur analysts drew diagrams of S4, mapping its supposed hangars against satellite images. Others created digital models of the sport model, sleek and silver, recreating Lazar's descriptions in three-dimensional form. Teenagers on message boards traded theories about element 115, while graduate students in physics debated whether gravity could ever be manipulated in the way Lazar described. It was no longer only his burden. It had become a puzzle handed from mind to mind, each one trying to solve it in their own way. And yet, the more the puzzle was passed around, the stranger it became. Some added details Lazar never mentioned. Some merged his account with older UFO lore. Roswell, the Tic Tac sightings, lights over Phoenix. His testimony had become a skeleton key, fitting into locks it was never meant to open. It was less about whether he told the truth, and more about how his story could be woven into a larger tapestry of mysteries. In Nevada, the desert itself began to transform. Groom Lake and Papoose Mountain turned into destinations of pilgrimage. Curious travelers drove dirt roads until warning signs stopped them. Tourists posed beside "no trespassing" placards, grinning at the invisible eyes watching them from hillsides. Every autumn, new groups gathered outside Area 51 for festivals that blended protest with carnival. Alien masks, neon lights, campfires under the stars. Most were not there because of Lazar alone. But without him, the desert might never have become such a stage. The echoes in the sky were not only about belief, they were also about culture. Films borrowed his imagery, hangars carved into rock, saucers shimmering as if half invisible. Video games placed players in deserts filled with secrets. Novels drew from his technical jargon, turning gravity amplifiers and element 115 into motifs of fiction. Even those who had never heard Lazar's name were living in a world where his story had quietly shaped imagination. But the echoes were not always celebratory. Skeptics sharpened their blades in equal measure. On podcasts and university stages, they dissected Lazar's claims, pointing to inconsistencies in his education records, to the impossibility of stable element 115, to the absence of photographs or documents. They laughed at the notion of buses with blacked-out windows, at biometric hand scanners decades ahead of their time, and yet, for all the mockery, they never quite erased him. Each attempt to silence only created another ripple. Doubt, like belief, carried its own echo. By the late 2010s, the conversation shifted again. Governments began admitting, in careful language, that they had indeed studied unidentified aerial phenomena. Pilots came forward with videos showing craft that accelerated without explanation, objects that left no exhaust, no heat signatures. To many, the movements looked eerily familiar. Asterisk, just as Lazar described, they whispered. Suddenly, skeptics had less to laugh about. The echoes grew louder, no longer confined to fringe corners, but creeping into headlines of respected newspapers. Younger audiences discovered Lazar through documentaries and streaming platforms. They did not see the fiery man of 1989, but an older figure, quiet, reluctant, almost weary. And to them, that very reluctance was proof. A liar seeks attention. A man who avoids it suggests something else. They watched him sketch diagrams with unchanging precision, heard him say he thought about S4 every day, and they felt the pull of sincerity. His voice, hushed and calm, carried the weight of someone who had not forgotten and could not. In this way, the echoes multiplied. Not confirmations, not evidence, but ripples across time. Each echo reshaped how the world viewed the sky. Pilots, scientists, soldiers, children. All looked up differently once they had heard the story. Some with wonder, others with suspicion, but all with a pause. That pause was the echo. It asked, asterisk, what if? What if the lights seen by Navy pilots were kin to the sport model? What if the technology Lazar described was real and waiting, hidden in some desert hangar? What if the future had already arrived and we had locked it away? To wander the Nevada desert today is to feel those echoes still. The wind moves across Groom Lake. The stars glitter, silent and distant. Somewhere beyond the fences, hangars may or may not conceal secrets. And yet, whether or not they exist, Lazar's voice has ensured they will never be forgotten. His memory has given shape to the unseen. His words have become landmarks on maps that do not exist. For some, this is evidence of deception, a myth so well told it infected the culture. For others, it is evidence of truth, an account so resonant it could not be silenced. The desert offers no answers, only echoes. Close your eyes and listen. You might hear the faint hum of an engine that should not exist. You might see the shimmer of a saucer bending light. Or you might hear only the wind, endless and indifferent. But even then, the echo remains, not in sound, but in thought. A whisper that says, asterisk, we are not alone. We have never been alone. And whether you believe it or not, that whisper now belongs to you too. Good night. Hash. Chapter 9. The Fallout and the Doubt. When a secret is spoken aloud, it does not simply vanish into the air. It lingers, colliding with ears, opinions, and agendas, each one reshaping it into something new. For Bob Lazar, stepping forward in 1989 did not only open the door to mystery, it opened the floodgates of doubt. The world rushed in, hungry for proof, eager for contradiction. And what followed was not silence, but a storm of disbelief, ridicule, and quiet fascination. This was the fallout. The first wave came from journalists. Local reporters, then national ones, descended on his life like vultures searching for scraps. They combed through university records, yearbooks, and transcripts. Lazar had claimed education at prestigious institutions, MIT and Caltech, but no record surfaced. No classmates remembered him, no professors confirmed him. To skeptics, this was the smoking gun, asterisk a lie exposed. To Lazar, it was proof of erasure, a deliberate cleansing of his past to discredit him. The government erased me, he said calmly. But calmness to many sounded like deflection. Soon, investigators turned to Los Alamos National Laboratory, where Lazar insisted he had worked. Official lists did not name him, yet a 1982 phone directory placed him there, and a local newspaper article described him near a particle accelerator. The contradiction deepened the debate. Was he a physicist as he claimed, or a technician elevated by rumor? Was the evidence that he was hidden, or that he exaggerated? Each discovery seemed to sharpen both sides, believers and skeptics, until the truth became less important than the fight itself. In UFO circles, Lazar's name rose like a prophet. Conferences quoted his testimony. Amateur researchers sketched maps of S4, layering his descriptions over satellite images. To them, his words filled gaps left open since Roswell. To skeptics, His words were nothing more than convenient fantasy. But what made Lazar's case unique was the intensity of the polarization. There were no casual opinions. People either dismissed him entirely or clung to him fiercely. And in that division, the story found fuel. The fallout was not just academic. Lazar's personal life began to crack under the weight. Friends drifted away, employers hesitated, strangers knocked at his door. Some offered support, others hostility. The man who had once blended into the background now found himself painted in bold colors. Hero to some, fraud to others. His life was no longer his own. It had become a battleground for belief. Skeptics often pointed to his mistakes. His arrest in the early 1990s, on charges unrelated to UFOs, became ammunition. Asterisk a criminal record, they said. Asterisk proved his dishonesty. To others, the arrest was evidence of harassment, a way to tarnish him publicly. Every stumble, every inconsistency was magnified, dissected, weaponized. Lazar's life became less about what he had seen and more about whether he could be trusted. And yet, the doubt never fully erased the fascination. Each attempt to discredit him seemed to carry an undertone of nervousness, as though silencing him entirely might draw more suspicion than letting him speak. Governments denied, but rarely loudly. Scientists dismissed, but often cautiously. The space between those denials became fertile ground for speculation. If he was truly lying, why not bury him completely? Why let the echo of his words continue? The fallout also revealed something deeper about human nature. People wanted answers, yes, but more than that, they wanted asterisk certainty. Asterisk. And Lazar's story refused to offer it. His claims sat precisely on the line between possible and impossible. Gravity amplifiers sounded absurd until they aligned with theories of space-time curvature. Element 115 sounded fictional until it was synthesized decades later, however briefly. Each point of doubt was shadowed by a sliver of vindication. And so the debate did not end. It looped endlessly, like an orbit around an unseen star. For Lazar himself, the doubt was corrosive. He had not asked for fame. He had not built a brand around his claims. He had only spoken. And yet he became a symbol for things larger than himself: secrecy, government power, human curiosity. Symbols are rarely treated kindly. He was dissected like a specimen, his every word tested against records, his every silence judged. Some nights, he confessed, he wished he had never spoken at all. But once a secret is spoken, it cannot be unsaid. And so the fallout became permanent. Conferences still debated him. Articles still mentioned him. Skeptics still mocked him. Believers still defended him. Lazar himself remained steady, never retracting, never elaborating, repeating the same story with the same quiet conviction. And perhaps that was the most unsettling part. Lies tend to mutate. But Lazar's story did not. It lingered, heavy and unchanged, like a scar the world could not decide was real. Step back and you see the irony. The fallout and the doubt were not proof against him. They were proof of him. Proof that his story had struck deep enough to demand decades of attack and defense. Proof that whatever he said, true or false, carried a weight the world could not shrug off. For 30 years, men and women who never met Lazar still argued about him in classrooms, pubs, online forums, and quiet desert campfires. Doubt became its own kind of belief, a belief that the question mattered even if the answer did not. Picture him in those years, tired, cautious, standing in front of a microphone at a rare interview. His voice calm, his hands still, a man accused of lies but refusing to change his story. Imagine the faces in the audience, some leaning forward with reverence, others folding arms in skepticism, both groups drawn by the same gravity, both unwilling to ignore him. That is the paradox of the fallout. It did not bury him, it made him unforgettable. And so the doubt remains. It has become part of the story, woven into it like threads in fabric. There is no Bob Lazar without the skeptics who doubt him. There is no fallout without the believers who defend him. Together, they form the strange ecosystem of mystery, a balance of ridicule and reverence that keeps the echo alive. So as you lie here now, listening to this story drift across the quiet, ask yourself, does doubt weaken a memory, or does it keep it alive? Perhaps the fallout was never meant to destroy Lazar's words. Perhaps it was meant to preserve them, wrapped in argument, carried by controversy, echoed again and again through time. And in that echo, half belief, half denial, the story of Bob Lazar still breathes. Good night. Chapter 10. The world reacts. Stories move like water. They seep into cracks, gather in hidden places, and sometimes swell into rivers that reshape the land. Bob Lazar's story was one such current. It began quietly in a Las Vegas interview room, his face in shadow, his voice altered. But once released, it did not stay confined to Nevada. It spilled outward, into living rooms, conference halls, magazines, and eventually, into the bloodstream of global culture. The world reacted not all at once, not with uniform conviction, but in ripples, each one bending the course of the mystery in its own way. At first, the reaction was local. News stations in Nevada ran the story as a curiosity, a man with an unusual claim, something strange to fill airtime between weather and sports. Viewers leaned closer to their televisions, some amused, others unsettled. The desert they drove past on their daily commutes suddenly seemed less empty. A place they had once ignored now throbbed with possibility. Then the story spread. National newspapers picked it up. Columnists debated Lazar's credibility. Some painted him as a whistleblower. Others dismissed him as a con artist. His name began to circulate in late-night talk shows and in whispered conversations at universities. The line between ridicule and respect blurred. People did not know what to believe, but they could not look away. Soon the cultural echoes began. Filmmakers found inspiration in his descriptions of hidden hangars and seamless craft. Television writers slipped references to gravity drives and element 115 into scripts. Toy companies manufactured saucers that resembled the sport model, packaged for children who had never heard Lazar's name. Video games recreated landscapes of Nevada, placing players in shadowy bases where secrets hummed beneath the sand. Whether the public believed him or not, his story fed imagination. The world, it seemed, was thirsty for the impossible. But reaction is never one-sided. Scientists and skeptics lined up to dismantle his claims. Lectures at universities ridiculed the idea of gravity amplification. Astronomers shook their heads at the notion of stable element 115. Journalists questioned his missing transcripts and absent diplomas. To many, Lazar was not a prophet but a fraud, a man with just enough technical jargon to sound convincing, just enough audacity to capture headlines. Yet even as they mocked him, they repeated his words. And repetition has power. The more they tried to dismiss him, the more familiar his story became. Belief spread not only through those who accepted his claims, but through those who denied them. Every article, every interview, every skeptical documentary kept him alive in the conversation. In UFO communities, the reaction was different. Reverence. For decades, enthusiasts had lacked a figure with both insider knowledge and the courage to speak. Lazar became that figure. Conferences buzzed with his name. Diagrams of S4 were passed around like sacred maps. The sport model became an icon, replicated in sketches, models, even tattoos. His testimony, fragmentary though it was, offered a framework into which every other sighting could be fitted. Roswell, Phoenix, the Tic-Tac objects, all could be explained, at least loosely, through the lens of Lazar's words. He became less a man and more a key, one that unlocked other mysteries. Governments, too, reacted, though less visibly. Official denials came, curt and cold. Yet behind closed doors, whispers grew. Senators asked questions. Intelligence briefings included terms once reserved for conspiracy theorists. Silence was no longer dismissal. It became a signal of unease. Decades later, when Pentagon programs investigating unidentified aerial phenomena were revealed, Lazar's story suddenly felt less like fantasy and more like prelude. The reaction was not always rational. In towns near Nevada, tourism boomed. Shops sold T-shirts with alien faces. Diners offered Area 51 burgers. Festivals sprang up where music and neon met under desert skies, turning secrecy into spectacle. For many, belief was secondary. What mattered was belonging, sharing in the story, wearing it on your skin, dancing to it beneath the stars. Lazar's story had slipped from the realm of testimony into the fabric of culture, becoming folklore in real time. As the years passed, the world's reaction shifted from laughter to curiosity, from curiosity to unease. In 2017, the release of Navy pilot videos showing craft moving in ways eerily similar to Lazar's descriptions reignited the debate. Suddenly, mainstream outlets like Asterisk, the New York Times, Asterisk and Asterisk, the Washington Post Asterisk, were using phrases once relegated to late-night radio. Objects not made by any known nation. Technologies defying explanation. To many, this was the echo of Lazar's claims, resurfacing after decades of doubt. The world had caught up, at least partially, to the language he had spoken long ago. And yet, Lazar himself remained unchanged. While the world debated, ridiculed, and celebrated, he retreated into quiet routines. He did not tour conventions. He did not release endless books. He ran a small supply shop, answered a few interviews reluctantly, and kept his life small. The contrast was striking. A world exploding with reaction, and a man shrinking away from it. Perhaps that very withdrawal gave him credibility, or perhaps it simply made the myth stronger. So what do we make of the world's reaction? Was it proof of truth, a slow awakening to what Lazar revealed? Or was it proof of humanity's hunger for mystery, our tendency to inflate stories until they glow brighter than their source? Maybe it was both. A man spoke in shadow, and the world, restless and curious, turned his words into legend. Close your eyes and imagine the desert again. Imagine the chatter of tourists in souvenir shops, the debates in lecture halls, the hum of music at festivals under alien-themed tents. Imagine the newspaper headlines, the skeptical laughter, the whispered questions in government offices. All of it is reaction, ripples radiating outward from a single stone dropped into the pond of history. And at the center of it all is one man, calm and weary, who never changed his story. The world reacts, the world forgets, the world remembers, but the echo remains, floating above us in the silent sky. Good night. Hash. Chapter 10. Into the Silence. Every story has a crescendo, a moment when voices rise, when debate sharpens, when attention peaks. But Bob Lazar's story, curiously, did not end in such thunder. It tapered, it softened, it dissolved into something quieter, something closer to stillness than spectacle. Silence did not erase it. Silence became its new shape. To enter Lazar's later years is to step not into crowds or conferences, but into a hush, an echoing space where words were rare, gestures were measured, and the weight of the unsaid hung heavy in the air. For decades, Lazar refused to perform the role many expected. He did not build an empire of speaking tours. He did not publish memoirs to capitalize on fascination. He declined most interviews, turning down invitations that would have paid well but cost him peace. "I'm not here to convince anyone," he said once, his voice steady, almost weary. "I'm just telling you what I saw." And then he would say nothing more. The restraint itself became a kind of testimony. Silence has its own gravity. It draws attention, breeds speculation, forces listeners to fill the void with their own interpretations. Some argued that his refusal to expand was proof of honesty. A liar would embellish, would adapt his story as years passed. Lazar did not. Others claimed the silence was tactical, a way to dodge inconsistencies. But whichever lens you chose, the result was the same. His quietness kept the story alive. Inside that silence, Lazar built an ordinary life, a modest home, a small shop supplying chemicals and scientific tools. He worked at his benches, labeling vials, shipping orders, repairing equipment. To outsiders, it looked mundane, almost dull. But those who recognized him knew this ordinariness was deceptive. For how can the man who claimed to have touched a machine from another star ever be ordinary again? And yet that was his choice, to live in understatement, to bury wonder beneath daily tasks. Visitors sometimes sought him out. They would drive hours to his shop, hoping for a handshake, a word, a glance at the man behind the myth. Lazar greeted them politely, rarely indulging their questions. He did not sign autographs, did not pose with alien posters. If pressed, he would sketch the same diagram he had always drawn. A saucer, 3 amplifiers beneath it, a central reactor. His hand moved without hesitation, the picture unchanged after decades. Then he would stop, tuck the paper aside, and return to work. That was all. Silence resumed. There is power in repetition, but there is deeper power in refusal. By refusing to adapt his story, Lazar created a paradox. Skeptics called it stagnation. Believers called it consistency. Both sides argued, but the silence between his words carried more weight than either conclusion. It suggested not apathy, but reverence, as though the memories he carried were too sacred, too fragile, to be reshaped by time. In interviews, when he did appear, Lazar's demeanor startled people. Gone was the fiery urgency of 1989. In its place was a man slower, more reflective, his sentences punctuated by long pauses. He did not tremble, but he did not glow with excitement either. He seemed, if anything, tired. Not tired of the story, but of carrying it. And in that fatigue, listeners found a strange intimacy, a sense that they were glimpsing not a performance, but a man who had borne silence longer than anyone should. Silence, of course, is never absolute. In Lazar's world, it was punctuated by small disturbances. Cars parked too long outside his house, phones that clicked when calls connected, helicopters that hovered low at inconvenient hours. He rarely spoke about these intrusions, but when he did, his tone was matter of fact. Not paranoia, not drama, just description. "They don't need to kill you," he once said. "They just need to discredit you." Those words hung heavier than any dramatic claim. Because silence can protect, but it can also suffocate. The deeper meaning of Lazar's silence is not about what he withheld, but about what he left for others. His story became less about convincing and more about provoking questions. Students debated him in classrooms. Engineers tested thought experiments inspired by his diagrams. Internet forums turned his interviews into endless threads of speculation. Lazar himself rarely joined the discussion, yet the discussion thrived. His silence was not absence, it was invitation. And perhaps that was always the point. Silence left space. Space for doubt, for belief, for imagination. Space for skeptics to sharpen arguments and for dreamers to sketch saucers in the margins of notebooks. Space for a mystery to become larger than the man who first whispered it. Imagine Lazar in his later years, standing outside at night. He looks up at the Nevada sky, at stars scattered like salt across black velvet. He does not speak. He does not need to. The silence between him and the stars says enough. He knows what he has seen. He knows what he cannot prove. He knows the story no longer belongs to him alone. It belongs to the silence it left behind. So what do we make of this quiet ending? Some call it anticlimax. Others call it wisdom. But perhaps it is neither. Perhaps it is simply the natural conclusion to a tale too heavy for endless telling. After all, not every truth shouts. Some truths whisper, some truths wait. Some truths, when spoken once, echo forever without needing to be spoken again. And so Bob Lazar fades not into obscurity, but into stillness. His silence is not emptiness, but resonance. It reminds us that answers may never arrive, that questions themselves may be the point, and that sometimes the greatest weight a man can carry is not knowledge, but the decision to say no more. Close your eyes now. Let the silence settle around you. The desert is still. The sky is endless. Somewhere perhaps machines hum quietly in hidden hangars. Perhaps not. What matters is the space between knowing and not knowing, the same space Lazar left us with. Into that silence you drift. Into that silence, the story remains. Good night. Chapter 11. The echoes remain. Not every story ends with a conclusion. Some end with a question that lingers, stretching across years, waiting in the corners of thought. Bob Lazar's tale is one such story. It does not resolve, it reverberates. Like sound in a canyon, like footsteps fading into desert dust, it leaves behind echoes, soft, persistent, impossible to silence. And those echoes remain, not only in the skies above Nevada, but in the minds of all who have ever wondered whether he was telling the truth. Decades after his first interview, people still whisper his name. They do it in dorm rooms late at night while scrolling through grainy videos online. They do it at desert campfires pointing toward the horizon, half joking, half afraid. They do it in classrooms where professors dismiss him, only for students to search his testimony later in secret. The echoes are not only what he said, but how he said it, calm, measured, unwavering. In a world of noise, his voice was a whisper. Whispers last longer than shouts. Governments have shifted, administrations have come and gone, technologies have advanced. But whenever official reports surface, whether from pilots, intelligence agencies, or declassified files, the Lazar story resurfaces too. He told us long ago, people say, as though reminding one another of a warning nearly forgotten. Even when those reports do not confirm his claims, the resemblance is enough. Craft without exhaust, objects that hover silently, maneuvers that mock inertia. Every time such footage plays, the echo grows stronger. And perhaps that is why his story never vanished. Not because it was proven, but because reality itself seemed to brush against it now and again, like wind rattling an old door. In culture, the echo is everywhere. Films and novels still borrow imagery of seamless saucers and hidden hangars carved into mountains. Musicians slip references into lyrics. Podcasters revisit his claims as though rehearsing folklore. Even casual memes online. Alien heads, desert highways, green lights in the sky, are faint traces of Lazar's story, rippling through generations who may never know his full name. What began as a revelation has become myth. Not myth as falsehood, but myth as persistence, as narrative that survives beyond verification. Myths endure because they answer something deeper than fact: the hunger for mystery, the refusal to accept that our knowledge is complete. The echoes also live in contradiction. Skeptics still argue fiercely, pointing to missing diplomas, legal troubles, and the absence of hard evidence. Believers counter with the consistency of his testimony, the later synthesis of element 115, the uncanny resemblance between his descriptions and modern sightings. Each side insists the other is blind, yet in their argument, they both preserve him. Doubt amplifies the echo as much as belief does. Think of it this way. If the world had agreed unanimously that Lazar was a liar, he would have been forgotten. If the world had agreed he was truthful, the mystery would have ended. It is the lack of agreement, the unresolved tension, that keeps the echo alive. For Lazar himself, the echoes were both blessing and curse. He never sought them, never cultivated them, yet they followed him into every corner of his life. Customers entered his shop asking not about supplies but about saucers. Journalists camped outside his door. Admirers traveled across states just to shake his hand. And in every interaction he was reminded the story no longer belonged to him. It had become public property, carried in whispers, debates, and late-night wonderings. He once said, "It's not about belief, it's about memory. I saw it, and I can't unsee it." That phrasing, memory, not belief, was itself an echo, a reminder that he did not ask for followers, only that he could not erase what he had witnessed. The echo was in him as much as around him. Today, long after the spotlight dimmed, the echo still moves. It moves in YouTube channels, dissecting every interview frame by frame. It moves in Reddit threads, where anonymous posters sketch theoretical propulsion systems. It moves in the silence between sentences. When someone asks over dinner, "Do you think we're alone?" It moves when a child looks up at the night sky and imagines not stars, but machines. And in those moments, Bob Lazar is present, not as a man standing at a podium, not as a name in a newspaper, but as an echo carried by voices who never met him. Imagine yourself lying in bed now, ceiling above, sky beyond. Somewhere out there, the desert wind still moves across Groom Lake. Perhaps the hangars are empty. Perhaps they were never there. Or perhaps deep within stone, a saucer still rests, humming softly, waiting for the day it is needed. The truth may never come. The proof may never arrive, but the question remains, and the question itself is the echo. That is what lingers. Not certainty, but curiosity. Not evidence, but wonder. The world may never know if Lazar was telling the truth, but in the end, that may not matter. What matters is that people are still asking, still wondering, still looking up at the night sky with suspicion and awe. Because once a story has entered the air, it never truly disappears. It rebounds, reshapes, whispers from one mind to another. And so it is with Lazar. His tale has become less about saucers and more about us, our hunger to know, our fear of what we might find, our hope that the universe is larger than our grasp. So, as you close your eyes and drift into sleep, let those echoes settle around you. Hear them in the quiet hum of night, in the rustle of trees, in the silence between thoughts. They remind you that the sky above is not empty, that questions are not weakness, that mystery is not defeat. The echoes remain. They always will. Good night.